All right, welcome to the review video for Ezekiel class, the final review video. And let me start by going over what kind of questions are on the test, and then we will go over some of the stuff that you might find on the test. Once again, this is obviously a very big test. I will try to cover everything that's on the test. However, you might want to glance over your notes just in case I miss something, all right? The first section, the first page will be short answer questions. And there are a lot of things that we've kind of gone over and over several times. The next section is a multiple choice section. And then there is a matching section. You might want to brush up on the cherubim and seraphim that we covered. And then there's a matching section, matching the prophets, priests, princes, and people. We talked about that section and the different things, the different ways that they were sinning. There's another short answer section. And then there's a matching section, matching different enemies of Israel and what they did to Israel and the sins of the enemies. Then we had a section dealing with Gog and Magog and all those terms. We just had that on the last quiz. And so hopefully that will be very something that you would remember right away. The last little section is a true and false section. This covers a lot of the stuff that we just kind of recently covered. One of the things that you might want to be aware of is the fact that I did give some notes in the last lecture that we haven't quizzed over. And so make sure you look over a few of those things. And I know that I kind of told you to note a couple of things, although we covered a lot of chapters. There is one essay question on here and two bonus questions. I know you'll get the bonuses as long as you fill them out, all right? All right, let's look at some information that you will see or potentially could see on this quiz. Of course, we know that Ezekiel was trained as a priest, and we mentioned that. We mentioned that he was taken in the captivity of Babylon in the second captivity. King Jehoiachin was the king at the time that was taken captive, and that happened at 597 BC. And so you probably want to know that date. We also mentioned that Ezekiel was contemporary with two other prophets, and that would be the prophet Jeremiah and the prophet Daniel. Of course, Daniel was the prophet to the upper class captives in Babylon. Ezekiel was a prophet to the middle class or the working class that were in Babylon. And Jeremiah was the prophet to the poor class that was still in Jerusalem during the siege. We mentioned that Ezekiel's message was basically that God would destroy Jerusalem and destroy his temple. And the false prophets were preaching exactly the opposite, that God wouldn't destroy Jerusalem and he wouldn't destroy his temple. We mentioned the fact that Ezekiel's name means strengthened by God or the strength of God. And of course, that was definitely the kind of man he needed to be, strengthened by God. We mentioned the very first chapter of Ezekiel dealt with the cherubim in the throne room of God. We mentioned, of course, there were 4 cherubim in that vision. And we gave you a lot of physical similarities of the cherubim. We mentioned that they had feet like the feet of a calf. They had 4 faces, the face of a man, the face of a lion, the face of an ox, and the face of an eagle, those 4 faces. We mentioned cherubim have 4 wings. We mentioned that their wings sound very loud, like a waterfall, like God's voice, and like a charging army. We also mentioned that they have a fire that goes up and around, down among them, and lightning shoots out of that fire. And they also run and return as a flash of lightning. We mentioned that the cherubim have wheels, all right, and they have very large wheels with eyeballs in them. We mentioned that the word cherubim has the idea of defenders of God's holiness. Of course, we mentioned several things they guarded, but they do guard the throne of God. We also mentioned the seraphim. The seraphim are, their name means burning ones. They are the ones that fly around the throne of God, and they cry out, holy, 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 all right? And they are the ones that eternally give praise to God. Of course, one of the difference between cherubim and seraphim are that the seraphim have 6 wings. Of course, we mentioned that Lucifer was a cherub, as the Bible says. The Bible says that Michael is an archangel. It doesn't say he's a cherub or a seraph. And of course, the angel Gabriel, it doesn't call him any of those. And so, anyway, we don't want to be confused or tricked by anything like that. We mentioned that part of the throne room of God, or you might say the floor of God's chariot that we have discussed, was something that went above the cherubim's head, and it was a firmament of sapphire stone, clear like crystal. And we mentioned that. Of course, God told Ezekiel that he was going to send him to a very wicked people, and these people he was to preach whether they would hear or whether they'd forbear. And God says there are some things that you should not be afraid of. God mentioned don't be afraid of their words, don't be afraid of their response, and don't be afraid of their looks. And of course, even today we see people do things like that to the preacher, and don't be afraid of it. God gave him a scroll, and he was commanded to do something kind of strange. He was commanded to eat the scroll. And of course, that represented fully digesting the message of God. We mentioned that Ezekiel was known for his silent sermons. One of those sermons required him to lay on his side for 390 days to represent the sins of Israel. And then he was to turn over for 40 days and lay on his other side for the sins of Judah. During that period of time, he was given a certain amount of food and a certain amount of water, and it was basically just enough to keep a person alive. God says during these different visions that he had, these different silent sermons, he mentioned that basically there would be three ways in which the people of Jerusalem would die. They would die by famine, by pestilence, and by sword. And of course, that's exactly what happened. During one of the visions, of course, Ezekiel was commanded to cut his hair off, divide it into three parts, and he was to represent each one of those as 1/3 of it by sword, 1/3 of it by famine, 1/3 of it by pestilence. And he was to take a little fragment of hair, put it in his belt, and that represented the remnant that God would leave over. We mentioned, of course, Ezekiel had a prophecy about the different abominations of Judah. We mentioned, of course, the image of jealousy, which was located outside near the altar, outside in the temple courtyard. Then we mentioned there was an inner chamber that happened in Ezekiel's vision, of course, that had all kinds of abominable creatures and all kinds of idols. And that was not a literal place, but the Bible says it was the chamber of their imagery or their imagination. We mentioned, of course, during that vision that Ezekiel saw women weeping for Tammuz. Tammuz was the Babylonian god of rebirth, basically, and of course showing the paganism. And also in that vision, he saw the elders of Israel with their backs towards the temple, and they were worshiping the sun. And so we see some of the different abominations. Of course, they were crying for the Babylonian god Tammuz, and they were worshiping the sun. We mentioned that God says because of these abominations, his glory would leave his temple. And we saw that illustrated in the book of Ezekiel, where God kind of slowly, the glory of God moved throughout the temple courtyard and eventually left the temple area through the eastern gate. Now we mentioned that's important because later on, at the end of the book of Ezekiel, we see the glory of God comes back in through the eastern gate. During this period of time, the people of Jerusalem, they had a saying. They said, this city is the cauldron and we're the flesh. And we mentioned the fact that Ezekiel picked up that line and said, yes, this city is the cauldron and you are the flesh. And basically God is going to cook you. And of course, we've mentioned several times that the cauldron represented the city of Jerusalem. The flesh represented the people. During this period of time, there would be some people that would be captive. Of course, Ezekiel was one of those captives. And Ezekiel had a message to the captives as well. He says, God will be a little sanctuary to you. He'll be a place to protect you. Of course, we know that the glory of God did leave the temple through the eastern gate, and the Bible says that it rested up and hesitated there on the Mount of Olives, which is symbolic because Jesus comes back on the Mount of Olives. We mentioned the sign of the bread. God told Ezekiel, when you prophesy about the captivity, you need to eat your bread with quaking and drink your water with quaking, representing the fear that would come upon those people as they were being taken captive during the siege. Of course, the false prophets continued to preach, and one of the things that Ezekiel likened their message to, he says that your message is like a wall that's poorly built. It's not been dabbed with mortar, and it will fall down, and that is what happened. Ezekiel mentioned in chapter 13 that part of the problem with these false prophecies were that it made the heart of the righteous sad, it strengthened the hands of the wicked, and it kept the wicked people from repentance. And of course, that is still a bad thing that happens today with false preachers. We mentioned in Ezekiel chapter 14 the fact that God said he would destroy the city of Jerusalem. And he mentioned three people. He said, even if Noah, Daniel, and Job lived in the city of Jerusalem, I wouldn't destroy it. And we mentioned what a great honor it was for those three people to be mentioned as righteous people. Of course, in Ezekiel chapter 15, we talked about the useless vine. And we mentioned that Israel was like a vine. It's been likened to a vine several times. But a vine is no good unless it bears fruit. In Ezekiel chapter 16, we mentioned Israel and Judah were likened to two adulterous sisters. And it is mentioned that Judah was the more wicked of the two. And we talked quite a bit about that. And God illustrated Judah's two sisters as Samaria and Sodom. And of course, both very, very wicked nations. We mentioned, of course, Ezekiel chapter 19. That was kind of an oddball chapter in that it was written in a musical composition, thought to be kind of a funeral dirge, all right, really representing the death of Jerusalem. We mentioned in Ezekiel chapter 20 that God said, even though he's had mercy on Israel several times, there would be consequence for their sin. But God would deliver. And he said, I delivered, and he said, for this reason, not because you were good, but for my name's sake. In fact, all throughout the book of Ezekiel, we see a common phrase, and we mentioned it several times, that you may know that I am God. And we see that several times, that they would know that he is God. That was a common phrase found throughout the book of Ezekiel. We mentioned, of course, God told Ezekiel to demonstrate the defiance of the people, and really to demonstrate God's defiance against the people by two actions that he did: smiting his hands and stamping his feet. And those were two of the actions to show the defiance there. We mentioned the different segments of the corrupt society that Ezekiel had to preach against. We mentioned there were four parts. The first part was the prophets. And we mentioned that the prophets, they pretended to build the lives of people, but they didn't. They conspired amongst each other with other prophets. They worked together to do evil. They devoured the people and took advantage of the people. We mentioned then there were the priests. The priests were the ones that were supposed to teach the law of God, but they themselves were violating the law of God. The priests were supposed to care about things that were holy, and yet they were profaning holy things. They were not respecting the holy days. They weren't distinguishing between right and wrong. We mentioned, of course, he mentioned the princes as well. And he described the princes as ravening wolves that used dishonest gain to take advantage of the people. And then finally, he preached against the people themselves. The people were oppressing one another. They were vexing the poor and the needy and the strangers among them. And of course, in that passage, God says, I'm looking for a man among them that should make up the hedge and stand in the gap. And he found none. What an unfortunate thing. In Ezekiel chapter 23, we see the prophecy of Aloha and Alohabah. We mentioned Aloha represented Israel, and that name means her own tabernacle. And that is because Israel did make her own tabernacle. She rejected the temple and, of course, built 2 golden calves. Alohabah represented Judah, which means my tabernacle is in her. And, of course, we know that the tabernacle, the temple, was in Judah. We mentioned that one of the sad parts about the book of Ezekiel was the fact that Ezekiel's wife died. And we mentioned she died on a very specific day. The beginning of the siege of Jerusalem was the same day that Ezekiel's wife died. And God commanded him, you can't mourn for her, you can't cry for her. Represented the fact that the people wouldn't be able to cry and mourn their dead during the siege. We mentioned several different enemies that Israel had and Judah had. And God mentioned 7 different nations that were judged. The nation of Ammon, which was a descendant of Lot. They were the ones that controlled the main king's highway. And they profaned the temple. They were happy at the fall of Judah. It is said of Ammon that they ripped up the women and enlarged their border through the land of Israel. Then we mentioned the nation of Moab, another child of Lot. It is mentioned there that they did several things. They hired Balaam to try to curse Israel. And we mentioned as well that there was some good that came out of Moab. Ruth the Moabitess came out of Moab. We mentioned some of the sins of Moab were that they were happy at the spiritual decline of Israel. And one of the heinous things they did was they burned the king of Edom's bones into lime. Then we mentioned the nation of Edom, all right, or Esau. He came from Esau. We mentioned the fact that they profaned the temple and treated God's people of Israel as not very special at all. We mentioned that Edom helped Nebuchadnezzar by attacking Israel during the invasion. And they were a very proud people. They were very proud of their mountain fortress of Petra. They were also ones that bought captives from Tyre and Philistia that were sold captive Jews. We mentioned that later on in history, the nation of Edom stole some of the land of Judah, the southern parts of Judah, when their land was taken over. And that southern part of Judah was called Idumea. And that was the land of Edom. Then we mentioned Philistia. And of course, we know Philistia, or the Philistines. That was the home of Goliath, the giant whom David killed. We mentioned that they lived on the seacoast of Israel, and they were governed by 5 different lords of the Philistines. We mentioned that they carried away a lot of captives for Nebuchadnezzar during that time. We also mentioned an interesting thing that David had a group of bodyguards that were Philistines. They were called the Cherethites. Kind of an odd thing there. We talked about the nation of Tyre, another enemy. We mentioned that Tyre was the commercial center of the ancient world. And we mentioned that the prophecy of Tyre, one of the most amazing prophecies, fulfilled prophecies found in the Bible. We went into quite length about it. We mentioned the prophecy stated that nations would attack it like the waves of the sea. Towers would be broken down. All of the walls and everything would be scraped into the sea. The dust of Tyre would be thrown into the sea, and it would become like a rock, and it would be a place for spreading of the nets and for fishing. We mentioned that was literally fulfilled, just as Ezekiel said. We mentioned that Nebuchadnezzar was the first to come up against Tyre, and he attacked Tyre, but the people of Tyre had already, most of them had retreated out to an island and built another city of Tyre out on the island of Tyre. Although Nebuchadnezzar conquered the old city of Tyre, and destroyed its walls and whatnot. He wasn't able to get the wealth of Tyre because it was out in the island. We mentioned that a couple of hundred years later, Alexander the Great came through and once again faced the same problem that Nebuchadnezzar did. But instead of giving up, Alexander the Great took all of the building supplies of old Tyre, all the broken down walls and everything, and threw it all in the sea and built a causeway that went out to the island of Tyre. And he even scraped the dust off and put it into the ocean. And we mentioned that was a fulfillment of the prophecy. He did conquer the island of Tyre. And today there is no island of Tyre. Actually, it's an isthmus because of the causeway that's still there from Alexander the Great. And by the way, there's a fishing village there where people still fish to this day. We mentioned with Tyre, there was an odd chapter, Ezekiel chapter 28, that had some symbolism in it. We mentioned that Ezekiel mentioned the prince of Tyre. And when you read the passage, you realize that he's not necessarily referring so much to the literal prince of Tyre as to somebody who would come someday, and we call him the Antichrist. He also talks about the king of Tyre, which once again was symbolic of Satan, and it mentions Lucifer directly. It also mentions the physical body of Lucifer. And one of the special things about the physical body of Lucifer is that he appears to have built-in musical instruments. Then we talked about the prophecy against Egypt, another enemy of Israel. And we mentioned that Egypt would be taken into captivity for 40 years. Not 70 years like Judah was, but for 40 years. All right. We mentioned as well, let me turn my pages here, that God prophesied to Egypt and said, Egypt, you might not think that you can be taken over, but remember Assyria? And God used Assyria as an example of a great empire that fell. And God used Assyria as an example to Egypt. We mentioned then the last couple of weeks we talked about the watchman and the importance of the watchman. If a watchman doesn't give warning, if he doesn't give out the truth, there is consequences for his action. Their blood will be upon his hands. We mentioned the fact that Ezekiel had been a watchman. He had been giving out warning. And Ezekiel actually lived to be able to see his message justified. During the book of Ezekiel, we see that during the siege, during the fall of Jerusalem, somebody escaped and fled all the way to Babylon and told them the city is fallen. And everybody knew that Ezekiel's message was the true message. We talked about the end times and the millennial kingdom. We mentioned that God stated that David would be prince of Israel under God, their king. And we also mentioned the valley of dry bones. And we mentioned, of course, an odd vision where all the bones came together and then flesh came upon them and then breath was breathed into them. And we mentioned the fact that that was representation of the fact that Israel, the process of bringing Israel together would be just that, a process. Israel isn't going to become God's nation overnight. It's a long process, and we are seeing that process unfold even to this day. We mentioned during that vision as well that Ezekiel took two sticks. One had the name of Judah written on it. The other had the name of Ephraim written on it, and he joined the two sticks. We mentioned the fact that that was a representation that the 12 tribes would be brought together someday. Then in the vision of Gog and Magog, we mentioned several things. We mentioned that Gog is the ruler of the invader of Israel. We mentioned Gog is also probably the king of the north, because it does mention he comes from the northern countries. We mentioned some of the other names. Meshach, very possibly Moscow in the Bible. Tubal, very possibly Tobolsk, which is another Russian city. We mentioned Magog is the place of Gog. And by the way, once again, we mentioned Russia. That's not a positive thing, but early Russians were called Magogites. And so does seem to be a connection there. We mentioned some of the other invaders of Israel during this time is Persia, which is also Iran, Ethiopia, which is in Africa, and Libya as well, which is in Africa, Gomer, which is very probably Germany, and Togarmah, which is probably Armenia, possibly Turkey as well. And so we mentioned that Gog and Magog, that would be an invasion of Israel that I believe tends to happen in the middle of the tribulation. And we discussed quite a bit about that. On our final day of lectures, we talked about the new temple. And have no fear, I'm not going to make you write out all the dimensions of everything in the new temple. All right, good thing that's not the essay question. That'd be very difficult, all right? But we did mention a few things about the building of the temple. Of course, we mentioned the glory of God does return back to the millennial temple, and it returns back through the eastern gate. We mentioned as well that the sons of Zadok would be the priests during the millennium. And of course, that represented the faithfulness of Zadok. And that he was faithful to David during that time. We also mentioned the fact that there would be sacrifices during the millennium, and that is a picture of basically a memorial of where they came from. And so there would be animal sacrifices, as well as marriage and giving in marriage, of course, if you survive the tribulation and go into the millennium. We mentioned as well that the prince, probably David, will actually sit in the eastern gate and eat bread before the Lord during some of the ceremonies there. Kind of a neat little reward there, I think, for David, who requested to be a doorkeeper in the house of the Lord. And we mentioned as well that the land, the Holy Land, would be divided up, and Israel would get much of the same lands, pretty much the same parts of land that God promised Abraham to begin with. One of the interesting things about the land is the lands of Reuben, Gad, and half the tribe of Manasseh that was found on the eastern side of Jordan, which was not originally part of the Promised Land, does not appear to be part of the land of Israel during the millennium. We also mentioned the fact that the tribes of Israel, that there, of course, would be a temple, there would be a holy portion of land right kind of in the middle, and then there would be tribes to the north and tribes to the south. And they were kind of given, you might say, horizontal bands of land. And we mentioned the two tribes that would be closest to the temple would be Judah, the tribe of Judah, which would be very close to the holy portion on the north side, and the tribe of Benjamin, which would be the closest to the holy portion on the south side. And we mentioned, of course, it was the two tribes, Judah and Benjamin, that made up the tribe of Judah, which did stay closer to God. We mentioned as well that the land of Israel would be healed. It would be a place of growth. And we mentioned that the healing would come from a river that would flow from the temple, and the water would go and heal the entire land of Israel, including the Dead Sea, which would no longer be dead. It will be a place for getting fish. We mentioned as well that the Jerusalem, the earthly Jerusalem during the millennium, will mirror the heavenly Jerusalem that's found in heaven, the New Jerusalem, in the fact that it has 12 gates as well. And we mentioned the very last thing, that the city of Jerusalem will have a new name, and that name is The Lord Is There. Thank you for being a part of this review video. I hope that you'll study very hard. Praying for you. We'll see you on Thursday.